The 2021 inauguration of Joe Biden as the nation's 46th president is an important ceremony, both in terms of the constitutional transfer of power and tradition. The fact that the outgoing First Lady did not provide the incoming First Lady with the tour of the White House, nor was she there with her husband to welcome the Bidens, is unfortunate, but it's also a part of the unusual history of this ceremonial transfer of power. While the First Lady is an important symbol, it is usually the behavior and the decisions of the president that end up dictating what she does or does not do. The highly visible role played by First Ladies and President-elects' wives during the transition through the inauguration have changed over the years. Some began traditions that are still with us, others began traditions that have faded away. Dolly Madison was the first First Lady to attend an inaugural ball in 1809, for example. Nobody did that for another 30 years. Nellie Taft, a feminist, was the first to insist on riding back with her husband to the White House after his swearing in. Lady Bird Johnson, in 1965, was the first to hold the Bible. There used to be a White House reception after the inaugural, as Mary Lincoln hosted, but that's gone. We know a lot about the fraternity of presidents and their predecessors, less so about the sorority which exists among First Ladies and their predecessors. Some have been friends, others have been rivals. It's often been not just politics, but health and personal decisions which dictate the role they play during the transition and inaugural. Abigail Adams wasn't merely the second First Lady, she was the first Second Lady, wife of the Vice President. So she was good friends with Martha Washington and knew the executive mansion in Philadelphia, which she then occupied, and didn't need a tour. When John Adams lost his re-election bid in 1800 to his old friend Thomas Jefferson, he and his wife Abigail left the White House before and did not attend the ceremony. Jefferson's wife, Martha, had died before he became president, and his daughter wasn't there when he left. But Dolly Madison, the next First Lady, knew the House well. She'd helped him serve as hostess. Because the White House was burned during the War of 1812, there was nothing to show Elizabeth Monroe. Being an invalid, Elizabeth Monroe was unable to show her successor, Louisa Adams, the House, and Mrs. Adams did not attend the inauguration of her husband's successor, Andrew Jackson, who had bitterly beaten him in his bid for a second term. It didn't matter. Jackson was a widower, his wife Rachel having died a month before the inaugural, and then his niece and daughter-in-law serving as hostess, but neither of them needed to be on hand because his successor, Martin Van Buren, was also a widower, his wife Hannah having died, and his daughter-in-law not coming in until the last 2 years. William Henry Harrison's wife, Anna, was unable to attend his inaugural, being too sick. His daughter-in-law, Jane, was there. She was also at his bedside when he died, becoming the first president to do so. His successor, John Tyler, came to the presidency with a wife who had suffered a stroke. She died in the White House. He left with his second wife, the much younger Julia Gardner, who loved champagne and dancing. In 1845, a couple of nights before James Polk's inaugural, the Tylers invited him and his wife Sarah to the White House for what was the very first transition. It was a dinner. Mrs. Polk, who did not approve of Julia's dancing and champagne, had all dancing stopped at her husband's inaugural ball. Peggy Taylor, who had no interest in being First Lady, attended none of her husband's 1849 inaugural ceremonies. She was at his bedside when he died in office. Abigail Fillmore came a couple of months after her husband's swearing in, and she left very sickly, actually dying right after she left. Jane Pierce didn't attend her husband's because their son had been killed in a train accident. Harriet Lane, who was the niece and hostess of the bachelor President Buchanan, her whole family got sick at the hotel. With all this sickness and death, none of these women either got or gave tours to the incoming First Lady. Harriet Lane was healthy, but she heard that Mary Lincoln was awfully loud and Western and didn't give her a tour, nor was she at the Lincoln inaugural. Hysterical when her husband became the first assassinated president, Mary Lincoln accused his successor of being part of the conspiracy to kill him. Needless to say, she offered no incoming tour. Eliza Johnson had tuberculosis, so there was no tour for Julia Grant. Besides that, her husband, Andrew Johnson, so hated Ulysses Grant that he became the third president not to attend the inauguration of his successor. Okay, Julia Grant loved being First Lady. After 8 years, she wanted another 4 years. She was really ticked off when her husband wouldn't run, and she didn't want to leave the White House. So she created a new inaugural tradition. Even after her husband was no longer president, she stayed in the White House and hosted a luncheon for her successor. It became kind of a transition meal that was a tradition for a while. So, 4 years later, in 1881, the outgoing Lucy Hayes hosts a dinner for incoming Lucretia Garfield and her husband. Garfield is shot. Lucretia leaves as a widow. His successor, Chester Arthur, enters the presidency, but he's a widower, his wife Ellen having died. His sister, Mary, serves as hostess, and when Bachelor Grover Cleveland gets elected, his sister Rose comes in, and so Mary invites Rose to receive with her at a reception, and it's kind of a transition tour. Rose hated being First Lady. Luckily, her brother got married to the White House, and Francis Cleveland really enjoyed it. When he sought re-election and ran against Benjamin Harrison, he lost, and the Clevelands hosted a formal transition dinner for Benjamin Harrison and his wife, Caroline. 4 years later, Cleveland again ran against Harrison and won. However, Caroline Harrison died in the White House, so there was no transition tour. But Frances did need it. She'd lived there for 4 years already. The Clevelands maintained the tradition, with McKinley coming in 1797, but his wife Ida's an invalid. She doesn't attend. McKinley gets shot. Ida's bereft. She leaves. No transition for incoming First Lady Edith Roosevelt. Edith Roosevelt could be kind of frosty and unpleasant, but she was well organized, and she invited Nellie Taft and her husband to dinner at the White House before the inaugural. It didn't go well. Mrs. Taft was heard to say in a rather loud voice, "I would have put that sofa there." They never liked each other. But Mrs. Taft invited Ellen Wilson and her husband Woodrow the night before Wilson's inaugural in 1913 and continued the dinner transition. Ellen Wilson died in the White House. Woodrow Wilson remarried. His second wife, Edith, really took charge after he had a stroke. But because of that stroke, there was no transition dinner, and Edith Wilson becomes the first to invite her successor, Florence Harding, for a tour of the White House. Did not go well. Edith Wilson said she'd only invited Florence Harding over for a cup of tea, and then she turned the tour over to the housekeeper because she really didn't like Mrs. Harding. She heard her voice down in the kitchen hours later. Florence was a little bit insecure, but she also could be a little bit vindictive. When Harding died as president and the Coolidges came in, Mrs. Harding did not give a tour to the Coolidges. The problem seemed more her dislike of Calvin Coolidge rather than Grace Coolidge. Friendly, warm, and easygoing, Grace Coolidge and Lou Hoover, her successor, were good pals. So the tour and then the ride together on Inauguration Day went off great. During World War I, Lou Hoover and Eleanor Roosevelt had actually been friends. But when Eleanor's husband defeated Lou's husband in 1932, there was a lot of bitterness. During the tour, Mrs. Roosevelt asked to see the kitchen. Mrs. Hoover said, "I've never seen the kitchen in 4 years, and I'm not going to start now." So Eleanor went into the kitchen alone. When Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945, Bess Truman, the vice president's wife, became First Lady. Although leaving the White House as a widow, Eleanor Roosevelt took time to tour Mrs. Truman through the house. She noted that her closets were as messy as Mrs. Roosevelt's. Although very different, the two women remained on good terms for the rest of their life. When Dwight Eisenhower was elected in 1952, Bess Truman took Mamie Eisenhower through the recently renovated White House, telling the staff there's going to be a lot of pink. The two women were very friendly, actually had taken a Spanish class together when Mrs. Truman was First Lady and hosted that in the White House. Although the Eisenhower inaugural saw a real frostiness between Harry Truman and Ike, Bess and Mamie had a great time. And even though Mamie and Harry got along and Bess and Ike got along, the husbands never got along. Nevertheless, the two women were seen laughing and having a great time in the drive from the White House to the Capitol. Mamie Eisenhower's White House tour for the incoming First Lady Jackie Kennedy was very formal. Jackie had just given birth to her son by cesarean and needed a wheelchair. Mamie said, "I'm not pushing her in a wheelchair unless she asks for it." She never asked for it. On the ride to the Capitol, Mamie joked that Ike looked like Paddy the Irishman in a top hat, forgetting that the first Irish-American president was about to be inaugurated. Vice President's wife, Lady Bird Johnson, was in Texas when President Kennedy was assassinated. She was there beside Jackie Kennedy. The two women had known each other as Senate wives, and despite the trauma and sadness of leaving, Jackie made sure that Lady Bird knew everything about the White House and gave her a tour before she moved out. Lady Bird Johnson and Pat Nixon had long been friends as Senate wives, and when Pat Nixon came for her tour of the White House upon her husband's election in 1968, the Johnsons even hosted the Nixons for a luncheon, reviving a bit of the old 19th century custom. On Inauguration Day, the transition went smoothly. Richard Nixon's 1974 resignation made the departure from the White House abrupt, and so Pat Nixon could not give her old friend Betty Ford a tour of the White House. Mrs. Ford had to contend with getting a tour from the White House curator. After the Fords retired back to California, the two old friends on occasion would see each other. Despite her husband's bitter loss to Jimmy Carter in the 76 election, Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter got along very well from the very beginning. Although Mrs. Carter said she detected sadness in Mrs. Ford, it wasn't long before the two of them joined forces, first on the Equal Rights Amendment and then on any number of other causes. They became such genuine good friends that Rosalind Carter delivered Betty Ford's eulogy. Rosalind Carter admitted that she was bitter when Ronald Reagan defeated her husband for re-election. When it came time to giving Nancy Reagan a tour of the White House, she did not want to show her the entire house. Then, when a story got out that Nancy Reagan apparently had suggested a wall of the Lincoln bedroom be taken down, it was reported that she blamed Mrs. Carter or her staff. They remained on friendly, cordial terms, but were never close. In 1988, when her husband was elected president, Barbara Bush got her first full look at the family quarters of the White House in a tour by Nancy Reagan, the press dubbed Battle of the Plaids. Despite the fact that both women had spent a lot of time together, it was later learned they never liked each other much. Nonetheless, the inaugural went off without a hitch. Despite their very different personalities and roles, when Hillary Clinton became First Lady in 1992, Barbara Bush, despite the bitterness at her husband's loss, welcomed Hillary for a tour of the White House with exuberance. The same friendliness prevailed during the Clinton inaugural. In later years, the two women got along well, although their differences never made them particularly close friends. In the 2000 election, it was Hillary Clinton who served as host to another Bush, Laura Bush, daughter-in-law of George and Barbara, who was the incoming First Lady. The two women seemed to get along well. The inauguration went off without a hitch, and in later years, the women found themselves together on occasion, particularly brought together by the friendship of their husbands. Without regard to partisanship, Laura Bush gave a very warm and welcoming tour of the White House to Michelle Obama. Mrs. Obama then began an inaugural tradition, bringing a gift for the outgoing First Lady. Even though Melania Trump's husband had made particularly harsh personal attacks on Michelle Obama's husband, Mrs. Obama nevertheless greeted Mrs. Trump warmly for her tour of the White House, and Mrs. Trump continued the tradition of giving a gift to the outgoing First Lady. While it's nearly impossible to separate the persona of a president from a First Lady, in the few contacts she's had with her predecessors, Hillary Clinton, Laura Bush, and Michelle Obama, Melania Trump has acted graciously and seems to be a part of them. Only time will tell whether that develops into anything further. As far as the new First Lady, Jill Biden, she need not worry about what it's like to live in the White House or the pitfalls of being First Lady. Over the course of her 8 years as Vice President's wife, she formed a deep, genuine, and abiding friendship with Michelle Obama. And so she always has her to turn to for any questions or advice.